Okay, today, or at least right now, economic systems, socialism, communism, and capitalism are going to be the big ones we look at. Now, these economic systems, the reason they exist at all is simply because of this whole scarcity problem that we've been dealing with since the beginning. This issue that we have finite resources, but we have infinite wants. So how do we satisfy all of them? We can't. How do we satisfy some of them? Well, that's the question. All right, so this is where we have those three economic questions. What are we going to make? How are we going to make it? And who is it for? So these three questions have to be asked and answered by economic systems, no matter what kind they are. It's not like there's somebody sitting around, like specifically, explicitly answering these questions, but yet they have to answer them in some capacity or another. It's baked into the pie. Okay? Ooh, pie. Take a moment. Yes. All right. Now let's start off with communism first of all. Those three economic questions: what we're going to make, how we're going to make it, who is it for, who answers those? That's going to be the state. The government answers all that stuff. Why? Well, it's because the government under communism owns everything. The concept of private property does not exist, or at least is extremely limited depending on the communist system. Now, if we're looking at communism, just a little background on this. It was started by this guy, largely anyway, Karl Marx. He had the big fluffy beard. Now, Marx, along with his writing partner Friedrich Engels, way back in the day, in the 1800s, wrote a few works. You had the Communist Manifesto, you had Das Kapital. The idea of communism is that you have a progression of history, followed along with this philosopher Hegel, who had this progression of history, and Marx altered it. But the idea was that the world would go through a course that was unavoidable. You'd have kingdoms and empires and stuff like this. Eventually you'd enter into the capitalist phase, which is where he was at the time. And sooner or later, you'd wind up with communism. That what would happen is that you had the capitalists, and these are people who own capital, the machinery, the factory, the means of production. And these guys would exploit the workers, all right? So the capitalists own the capital, they own the machinery, they own the stuff, whereas the laborers own nothing but their labor and their ability to work. And so in an industrial economy, according to Marx, the evil capitalist overlords would exploit the laborers and use them in order to enrich themselves while oppressing the workers. Eventually, the workers, united by their class interests, no matter where they were, would recognize that they're all workers, and so they would unite together and overthrow the capitalists and take over the means of production for themselves. So as this whole workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains concept. Okay, so this was the entire idea anyhow, and what Marx claimed is that it eventually, inevitably, unavoidably, this would occur, that the workers would unite together and overthrow the capitalists, and eventually you would wind up having a communist society. Not just a communist society, but ultimately you would have an entire communist globe, where everybody would do what it was they were supposed to. You wouldn't even need a government. You wouldn't even need money. Instead, everybody would put into the society whatever it is they could, and they would take from the society whatever it is they needed. The saying was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So you give what you are able to through labor and whatnot, and then you take what it is that you require. Okay? So this was the general idea, that eventually you get to the end point of history, which for Marx was going to be a communist endpoint. Okay, so the first real big communist society, anyway, we've got the Soviet Union. So there you got Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was the founder of the Soviet Union. And, well, he's, you're going to eat cherry pie around Congress because it's red. Red is the color of communism, you know, the red flag and stuff. But under a communist system, the government controls everything, owns everything, especially owns the means of production. Right? Everything that you use in order to make stuff, all that capital is going to be owned by the state. Now, the idea, all right, with communists here is that, well, the government is acting in the capacity as the representation of the will of the people. And pure communism and that eventual endpoint utopia down at the end of the line of history, you wouldn't even need a government anymore. But in the meantime, you have one during this transition period, and the government will act as the representation of the will of the people, and so it owns the means of production to make sure that everything is used correctly and is collectively owned, communally owned, hence the term communism. So this is the theory anyway. So what are we going to make? Well, the government will decide what we're going to make. How we're going to make it, the government's going to decide that also. Who's it for? Government also gets to decide that because the government owns all this stuff. Okay, depending on the communist society, it may be that there is no private property at all. You might have something that you consider to be your own, but no, it belongs to the state. It belongs to everybody. Okay. Now, property rights under communism, if it's going to be pure communism, you don't have any property rights. Everything belongs to the state, belongs to the government. So this beautiful cherry pie right here is just oozing onto the plate. Oh, man, that's good stuff. Well, you don't get it. That belongs to the workers. It belongs to the state. It belongs to the government. It belongs to all of us. Okay? Now, the incentives under communist system can be a little bit complicated. Because if everybody's supposed to be treated equally, you only get what you need. Everybody's going to be treated the same. Well, you can't exactly give people raises necessarily or reward them in the conventional fashion. All right, certainly they're not putting your own stuff at risk. So you're taking away the positive stuff, right? The positive incentives, the carrot, right? The reward. So what are you left with in order to compel behavior? Well, a lot of times you get left with the stick. Okay? So we can't reward you for doing what you're supposed to, but we can certainly punish you for not doing what you are supposed to, or for doing what you're not supposed to. Okay? So if you look at the early Soviet Union, you actually saw the stick being exercised quite a bit. In fact, there were cases where you could be late for work even a few times, and you'd be arrested and sent to the Gulag, the prison labor camp. Well, why there? According to the communist mindset here, right, think in terms of being communist, if everybody's supposed to put into the society whatever it is that they can, and they take whatever it is they need, well, if you're showing up late for work, you're not putting in what you're supposed to, but you're still taking whatever it is you need. So effectively, what are you doing? You're stealing. You're a thief. You're stealing from everybody else in the society. So therefore, you'll be punished like a thief. So this is the problem, right? Sometimes this is called the tragedy of the commons also. I won't go into details there. But the real basic issue with this is that if everybody owns everything, then nobody owns anything. Okay? If everybody owns everything in the society, it's all communally owned, that means that nobody actually owns anything themselves. And you think about, well, whose stuff do you care about more? Do you care about other people's stuff more, or public property more, or do you care about your stuff more? Well, chances are you care a whole lot more about your stuff than anybody else's or public property because it's your stuff. It represents the labor and the money that you earned, that you committed. It represents your own investment. It represents your own risk. You have to be responsible for the damage if something happens to it. So you actually care a lot more about it. Okay? So you have a system in which nobody owns anything, though, right? If everybody owns everything, then nobody owns anything, and they will treat it as such. This is one of the core problems that we run into. Okay, economic freedom under communism, officially it's very limited or none. In some communist systems, they would even tell you what it was that you were supposed to do, right? What your job was going to be. Although there's always a thriving black market, even in some of these places. If you look at North Korea, this is about as close to communism as we can get, a pure communism anyway, even though it's still kind of distant. But even there you see a black market for all sorts of goods, right? Markets are really incredible things. What it comes down to is that if somebody is willing to pay enough for it, and they're willing to pay that price, there's going to be somebody else who will be willing to supply it. Markets will always find a way. They'll always find a way around government actions. Okay. Now, competition under communism, there's little to none. Well, why? Because the government owns everything. In fact, a lot of times communists thought that competition was destructive. They thought it was inefficient because you had all these different companies and all these different businesses doing the same thing, competing for the same resources, making the same stuff. And they thought, well, how much better would it be if you just had one entity, the government, who was going to be creating all that stuff on its own? Right? That, oh, we'll be able to do it much more efficiently and won't have this wasteful competition that is occurring. So, pie versus cupcake? Well, no, you don't get a choice. There's not going to be competition between the pies and the cupcakes. The state will decide who gets pie and who gets cupcakes and what those will look like. This guy right here, this is Mao Zedong. He was the dictator of communist China, the founder of it also. So he's got his Mao Mo right there. All right. There are some episodes actually with communist China that gives a good idea of some of the inefficiencies with communism. The Chinese at one point under Mao had what was known as the Great Leap Forward, and it was this 5-year plan to try to industrialize China from being more of an agrarian to more of an industrial economy, and it was a complete disaster. They mandated that villagers would create steel in each village, and they were given a certain quota of steel that they were supposed to produce. And these blast furnaces were completely insufficient for the task. Instead of creating steel, they produced pig iron. And not only that, but you had to have inputs. You had to have iron that went into these blast furnaces in order to try to create steel. Well, you're thinking about you're in these villages. Well, what do the villagers mainly do? What's their occupation? They're farmers. So they're taking farmers out of the field and telling them, oh, hey, farmers, you got to make this steel now. How's that going to turn out? Well, they're not going to make very much steel, but you lose out on a lot of crops. Not only that, but they're melting down their iron farm instruments in order to be able to do it. So as a result, agricultural output was plummeting. At the same time, part of the Great Leap Forward was killing birds. That was one of the platforms, right, was you had to kill sparrows because sparrows were the enemy of the people. Those little birds go around and they eat grain and they cause problems. So what do? We kill them. And we can try shooting him, I guess. One of the techniques they used was they just scared him out of trees. So they would have a day that was going to be sparrow killing day. And they'd go around and bang drums and bang pots and pans. And the sparrows would get scared and they'd fly out of the trees and fly around. Every time they tried to land, bang the pots a little bit more. So they were scared and they'd fly up in the air. So they literally exhausted the birds until they fell down dead out of the sky because they just kept flying around and were unable to land. And they killed millions of sparrows and other birds as a result. Now, the reason this was a problem is sparrows, yes, they eat grain. Let's see, what else do sparrows eat? Oh, yes, insects. In fact, they eat far more insects than what they did grain, and guess what the insects eat? The insects eat lots of grain. So they got rid of the sparrows, the insect population boomed, agricultural output went down even more because they're losing what crops they were producing to bugs. And just within about, 2 or 3 year period, estimates are as high as 80 million people died of starvation in China as a result of the Great Leap Forward. So purely avoidable economic mismanagement by the dictator, Mr. Mao there with his Mao Mo. So the role of government in communism, obviously, is quite a bit because the government controls everything. Under communism, it is both an economic and a political system. It's both at the same time. Okay, so let's look at socialism then. Those 3 economic questions, who answers them, what, how, and who, it's a little bit of both actually. It's going to be the state as well as private individuals. This is because the biggest difference between socialism and communism is that under communism, the state owns and controls all of the capital, right? Any sort of business or industry is owned and controlled by the government. Under socialism, however, the government does not control all of it. Instead, it controls some of it. Typically, it's going to be whatever the most important industries are for that country. So maybe the electrical grid or electrical generation, it'll own that. Maybe if oil production is very important to that country, then they'll nationalize that industry and also own and control that. So they won't own and control everything, they'll just own and control chunks of it. Possibly big chunks, maybe smaller chunks, depending on the socialist system in question. Okay, so usually key industries could be many industries, right? But even there, for the industries that the government does not own and control, it typically still has a high level of control over those privately owned industries. Okay, now socialism is also compatible with different political systems. It's an economic system, but not necessarily a political system. Communism was both. Okay, under socialism, you could have a socialist economy that could be coupled with a democratic government that was parliamentarian. You could wind up having a dictatorship. You could have an oligarchy, I suppose. You could have all sorts of different types. All right. Now, property rights under socialism, a lot of this we keep saying it depends. It depends on the system. You do have some property rights in socialism if you're talking about areas of the economy where you're allowed to have private ownership of that area of the economy. If it's going to be publicly owned, obviously you wouldn't be have property rights there because you wouldn't be allowed to have anything in that area anyway. Okay, incentives, again, you got positive and negative incentives, rewards and punishments. You can kind of roughly think of them. But again, it depends on the area of the economy involved. Economic freedom, it's there far more than what you'll see in communism, typically. However, the level of economic freedom will depend on the country. Some socialist systems will provide more economic freedom than others will. Okay, competition, again, it depends on the country. It depends if you're in a public sphere or if you're in the private sphere of the economy. And the role of the government is going to be where you still have quite a bit, right? So the government will still have a large role in how it is the economy operates. Okay, so let's shift from there and talk about free enterprise. This is going to be capitalism, markets. We'll use these terms roughly interchangeably. So who answers the three economic questions? What are we going to make? How are we going to make it? Who is it for? This will be determined by private individuals. Private individuals get to own the different chunks of the economy. The government might own like a few small things here and there, right, for its operations, but it's not supposed to be in competition or in any sort of business whatsoever. Okay. Now, again, this will differ depending upon country. There's no really pure communist country out there. There's really no pure capitalist country out there either, or free market economy, right? We're all what we call a mixed system, okay, where think of us as being on a spectrum. But I'll come back to that here in a little bit. So we have our choice of pies. Oh, man, that's a state fair with all sorts of tasty apple pies. Right, there we got a little wheel o pie. We got some lemon ranks, cherry, pecan, apple, pumpkin, blueberry, good stuff. Well, you get to choose which pie you're going to produce. You also get to choose which pie you're going to buy. So that is up to you. So says Friedrich Hayek, there, an economist, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Property rights on free enterprise, you got a lot. In fact, property rights are somewhat primary. This is very much a Lockean conception that we have with our political ideology. This idea that life, liberty, and property are the three primary natural rights that you have, and the governments are instituted in order to guarantee and ensure those rights. And one of the reasons property is so important is that whole private property aspect. Okay, you don't care as much about other people's stuff, and you don't care as much about public property that everybody owns, which nobody owns, but you care a whole lot about your stuff, right? The things that you bought and the things that you invested in. So you have an incentive to use it appropriately and correctly because it is your stuff. So property rights under capitalism and market economies are exceptionally important because that has to be guaranteed. That something belongs to you and you will profit from it if you decide to use it for some sort of investment purposes or to be able to produce. It belongs to you, can't be taken away from threats within the society, threats from outside the society, it's like foreign countries' wars, and it's also safe from, most crucially, the government itself, that it just can't come along and take it from you, okay? So you have a right to that property. So when we look at a lot of, say, Declaration of Independence, you see stuff in there about it. You look at the Constitution, there's stuff in there that's effectively guaranteeing property rights in one capacity or another. There's plenty of laws that are meant to guarantee property rights. Titles and deeds that show that you own property, say cars or real estate. Okay, contracts that transfer property from one to another, that stuff you can give to other people when you die, the right to bequeath, intellectual property, copyrights, trademarks, stuff like that. All right, all of that is, again, ensuring that stuff is your stuff, so you can profit from it, which gives you an incentive to actually do something with it. So political ideology, we see this with the whole life, liberty, and property. We see this with Locke. We see it in the Constitution. We see it in the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going into detail about it like I maybe normally would have. But you see a lot in the 5th and 14th Amendments, if you want to look those guys up. All right? That helps ensure property rights. Okay, incentives under capitalism obviously have quite a bit. The rewards and the punishments. Okay, and it's all about self-interest. If you've watched The Invisible Hand, or you're going to that presentation, this is a big deal. And self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness. That's a completely different thing. Self-interest is just a natural thing that people wind up having. Okay, and that self-interest that we have, looking to benefit ourselves, motivates us to actually do things for other people. But that's all handled when we talk about Adam Smith. Okay. Ideally, under a free enterprise system, you would have total economic freedom, although in practice, that's never going to want to be the case. There's always going to be some limitation on economic freedom. For example, you can produce cokes over there on the one side, but maybe not that leafy substance on the other side, unless you're in Colorado, I suppose. We have to change this picture to something else as the way things are advancing. But it's not like you're able to buy, sell, and produce whatever it is that you want, right? There are limitations on what you can do. So it's not as if we have perfect economic freedom. And it can vary by age. So you're all under 21. Likely if you're watching this, you're not allowed to buy alcoholic beverages. Or I guess tobacco now has hit that 21 mark. Competition under free enterprise, obviously there's quite a bit. You want having businesses competing with each other in order to get you to spend your money at their place as opposed to somewhere else. Okay. Let's see. The role of government, ideally limited to none, but again, it depends on the system, right? You're always going to have some sort of regulation, and regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly it can be excessive to the point it can be damaging to the economy, but some level of regulation can be beneficial and actually help markets work better. Yep. So we're all in a spectrum here, right? Going from one to another. So here be an example of it, right? So you got the centrally planned economies on one side. Let's say you got Iran, North Korea, Cuba. On the other side, free market economies. Hong Kong is unfortunately shifting further to the left. Centrally planned economy as China takes more control over it, right? But when we look at this stuff, and it used to be that I would have you read Hayek, but since we're online, I'm not going to have you do this. But Hayek has this insight where he realizes that one of the problems with planned economies, socialized economies, a visible hand economy, is that it is inefficient, right? That the planned economists guys, the socialists and the communists, they try to make it seem like there's a choice between chaos with an invisible hand and order with a visible hand. And what Smith says is, or excuse me, what Hayek says is that's not the case at all. They try to make it seem like it's a choice between planning and not planning, but that's not it. Instead, what we have is a choice between planning and planning. But the difference is who's planning for who. Okay, everybody plans. You plan. You're planning what you're going to do this weekend. You're planning what you might do with the rest of your life or going to college, right? You're making short-term and long-term plans. Everybody plans. Okay, but in a planned economy, in socialism or communism, instead of planning for yourself, other people plan for you. Right? So the choice is not between planning and not planning. It's not between order and chaos. The choice is between order from the men of systems, as Adam Smith would have called it, a visible hand that is going to organize the economy as it sees fit, or an invisible hand, spontaneous order that just arises and produces products out there like our very nice pencil. Where nobody's planning this to occur. Nobody's creating it to happen. It just does. It arises out of everybody operating out of their own self-interest, and here you get stuff. Okay? So, do you want the planners or the not planners? That's not the question. Do you want planners or planners? Who's planning for who? You plan for yourself, other people plan for you. Problem with other people planning for you is they don't know what you want. They don't know what your desires are. They don't know what your needs are, even necessarily. So they're trying to create one-size-fits-all approach where they're just going to decide what they think you should want as opposed to what you actually want, right? And what you should be good at doing as opposed to what you think you might be good at doing. And the problem with these planners is a knowledge problem. The knowledge required to be able to operate the economy exists out there in the heads of every individual out there in the economy, every individual in the country, every individual in the world. 7.5 billion heads out there, minds, living, breathing human beings. And each one of them has their own desires, their own wants, their own ways of looking at the world. All right? Each one of them knows about what is needed where they are. That the knowledge needed to operate the economy is highly individualized, localized, and individualized, right? That I know what is needed around, say, Rockwall because I'm here, right? I have no idea what's needed in, say, I don't know, Lincoln, Nebraska. I don't know, maybe they need corn. They've got plenty of corn. Right? But I don't know what's needed in those places, and you're going to tell a central planner, right, that's going to be sitting around in one location, let's say in Washington, D.C., or wherever seat of government is, and they're to determine what is going to be needed for everybody everywhere in the country, and they're going to make decisions based upon that, right? How can they possibly have that sort of data accessible to them? They can't. Even if they could somehow have that data, how are they going to be able to collate it and be able to make good decisions based upon it? And how will they do it in a timely fashion? I mean, by the time they would get the numbers in front of their faces, it could be a couple of months old, right? Economic conditions would have severely changed in the meantime. So they're going to make decisions based on obsolete data? That's a recipe for disaster. Okay, so the planners are, it's a knowledge issue. They don't know. They don't know what they don't know. They're ignorant, and they will make bad decisions as a result. And Hayek realizes that this is a significant problem, right? Let the invisible hand operate the way that it's supposed to. Don't do this visible hand, which is just going to screw everything up. Okay, I will end with this. I like pastries, obviously, and these desserts. This is a churpumple. This is the king of all desserts. This is a turducken of cakes, I guess you could say. Now, the churpumple is it's majestic. Look at that thing. You take an apple pie, a pumpkin pie, and a cherry pie. 3 individual pies. You bake each one inside their own cake, and then you layer all 3 pie cakes together into one gigantic dessert. Okay? So apple pie, pumpkin pie, cherry pie, each inside their own cake, to create this beauty, this magnificence. I had a student who made one time, or she convinced her grandma to try making one, and she brought it, and it was delicious. You think these flavors don't go together? They do. They totally do. So here's a couple more pictures of churpumples. Okay, so that's it.